Hi, I hope you're all well. My name's Paul Forder, Regional Manager for Wesleyan Financial Services. I'm joined here today by my colleague and fellow Regional Manager Simon Appleyard and our Account Manager Graham Leyfield. Today we're here to really discuss about the key financial planning risks associated with primary care networks and a quick look into the future. Right, Simon, I think the first question I've got is for yourself, and it's really around where does a PCN start when it comes to their financial planning?
Yeah, good question. The interesting thing, of course, is that the PCNs have been around now for 4 years. However, whilst there were some really good early adopters, the impact of COVID and all the dislocation in primary care that caused has meant that it's only really in the last 12 to 18 months that PCNs have started to really get to grips with some of the key challenges that they face, and things like the liabilities, etc. So to give you some examples, obviously PCN doesn't have an automatic legal status,
Mhm.
and there are options, and how you set that up. Well, that then leads to questions such as, who do the liabilities of a PCN lie with? Are they sitting with a central organisation, with the PCN themselves? Are they with a lead practice? Are they spread across the practices? So who's responsible for those costs? In a similar way, employment, with all the different roles that there are, who's actually the employer here? Because again, it will differ in terms of whether it's a PCN themselves, whether it's lead practice, whether it's across the practices, as to where that sits and who's responsible for the HR element, as far as that's concerned. And above all, there's what about the management side of things? Across those three aspects, again, who is responsible for which decision making? And that has all sorts of implications. So I guess the starting point, therefore, is to get some specialist legal advice.
Mm.
And once you've got that bottomed out, then to actually look at, well, how do I protect this? How do I protect this particular business?
Thanks for that, Simon. There's a lot of stuff to consider, actually. So, Graham, I've got the next one. I'm going to probably aim at yourself for it. So, most PCN staff fall within the R's funding. What should a PCN consider for these staff for areas like long-term absence through illness?
So you're absolutely right. So the additional role reimbursement scheme is where most, and certainly all the clinical roles within the PCN are funded from. And the first question when you're then starting to consider some of the protection challenges is really simply to say, well, what sort of percentage, what sort of capacity might there be left within the additional within the R scheme? Because with the absence of one of the R's funded roles, you can apply to continue to fund any sick pay arrangements you might have through the R's funding. But whether you can then afford to get a replacement in depends upon the capacity you've got left. So the first question you've really got to start with is, what percentage of our R's funding are we using now or planning to use in future? Because if you're getting towards capacity or at capacity, it means there's very little left or none left to find replacement costs from. So if you start by looking at the sort of the capacity side of things, of what you can do within the R's funding, then you're looking at trying to work out which job roles are essential. And it's the conversation that I'm regularly now having with primary care network sort of management teams is that when you're getting towards that capacity, part of your contingency planning for your PCN is to then say, look, which of the roles that we fund are essential, that we have to maintain because that's essential for delivering patient services. It could be that you could argue that all the roles are essential, but there might be within that some that you say, well, actually, we don't want to live without it, but if we had to, we could. So what you're trying to establish is what funding do we have? What roles do we have to replace? What will that actually cost to do? And where does that sit within the network? Simon mentioned legal structure. Well, that's part of that. Who employs people? Who have got the responsibilities? Um, and then once you've had those conversations, or even earlier in the process, talk and get some specialist advice. It's the conversations that our specialist financial advisors are having regularly now with primary care network teams across the country. And it's that sort of process of capacity, essential, contingency plan. What can we do about solving those problems?
So that's really good points you made there, Graham, about the arts funded side of things. But what about those roles that are not arts funding, such as clinical directors, PCN managers? What's the situation to think about there?
Yeah, really good point, and it's a different challenge to the R's funded roles, because obviously you've got people potentially directly employed, and clinical directors, it may be almost on a subcontract basis with practices. But if I take the role, sort of management role that PCNs are taking on, which is becoming more and more common, and a reflection of the actual specialist nature of managing a PCN. Those people will have a contract of employment. So first and foremost, on a personal level, what sick pay arrangements have you got, and on a personal financial planning, anybody employed by the PCN, just check what arrangements that you've got in place. But from the PCN point of view, there's a finite amount of funding available for paying for management teams, etc. So actually, the contingency planning is as essential and for these roles as any of the R's funded roles. And it's actually saying, look, if we've chosen to take this role on and pay and use our funding to employ this person, what's our contingency plan if that person isn't able to work long term, absent? How do we replace that within the network? Who's responsible for taking it on there? You mentioned earlier about the understanding where the employment structure is. Often with the PCN ones, it will be directly through a PCN or a federation that merged together. But what sick pay arrangements, what funding, and if we have to get somebody in, whether that's from within the network or externally, what costs are involved with doing that, and who's responsible for paying them? Because the PCN has no additional funding, will it fall to the network? Do the practices within the network recognise and understand that that's something that they might have to contribute towards? So it's about having those conversations. It's about getting the right conversation with your colleagues across the network about what are our plans for specific roles that we might employ. Our specialist financial advisors again will be able to help with actually with those conversations and making you aware of some of the solutions that might be available to protect those.
So one of the things that I mentioned at the start there is the fact that the PCNs have been around since 2019. So that means that the funding cycle comes to an end in 2024.
Yes.
So what I'm really interested then is the view on the impact that that might have on PCN planning needs.
It is a great question, because you're right, Simon. I mean, the funding does finish next year, and it's going to change significantly next year. And with the potential of an election as well coming in, things could be dramatically different. So nobody really knows what it's going to look like. However, doesn't take away from the need for financial planning right now. Okay, because it's important, because when we ever look at financial planning thing, we always kind of take a snapshot of here it is right now. This is what it looks like, and we can then sort of say the impact of stuff as it's going to happen. And with PCNs employing thousands of people, whatever the changes come on to this in the future, it will still kind of look very similar. How similar it looks, we don't know, but it doesn't take away from the doing it right now, because ultimately the need is there. If something happens, Graham, you mentioned earlier about the event of sickness for these people, we need to make sure that we can show you that this is where you currently are, this is what it looks like, and this is the implication of these things. So it's important to review the here and now. But one of the things that we do on a regular basis, which I'm a big fan of, is we look at it every year. We'll review it every year. So we can take into account these changes, whether it's the PCNs, the funding side of it, and part of the Wesleyan Financial Services and being this, we mentioned the specialists before, wholly looking after the medical, is we keep up to date with these things. So as these changes happen, we'll be active in contacting you. Some of the key bits for your considerations for the PCNs as well, though, is once we've had the reviews, that you'll have changes. So it's important the other way around as well. Our reviews will kind of take place. But like I say, it will change. What it looks like, nobody knows. But what we will do is make sure that we review it and take into those account those changes.
So hopefully you've had some value out of the session today and found it useful. We at Wesleyan Financial Services have a unique understanding of the financial planning needs for those in primary care. And if you have questions or you want to explore in more depth the issues and how they will impact upon you, please come and book a no obligation appointment with one of our specialist financial advisors. And you can do so via our wesleyan.co.uk website and follow the links.